Welcome, everybody, to the many of you who are online and the wonderful people who are here in this room. Welcome. My name is Sofia Gruskin, and as Director of the Institute on Inequalities and Global Health here at the University of Southern California, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's dialogue, Cities and Universities Working Together for Sustainable Development, Reflections from Los Angeles and OECD Partners. I have to say today marks the conclusion of a very interesting week with a wonderful delegation of visitors. And we couldn't be happier to have you all here for us to be able to have a conversation together and engage in some reflection and ideas. I wanted to give a little bit of backdrop to the story first, just to start. So in spring 2024, we at the Institute began a new and exciting partnership with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And with the US components graciously funded by the Lumina Foundation and engaging several university local government partnerships. The goal of the project as a whole is to explore the role that higher education institutions play in supporting cities and regions to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There is a focus on localizing international frameworks and boosting capacity for innovation in city governance, with the idea of understanding the ways in which higher education institutions leverage their collaboration engagement agenda in order to provide services, including innovation, in ways that can help local and regional authorities improve their own performance, and with attention to the UN Sustainable Development Goals to the extent that that can be relevant. So as part of this project, we welcome a delegation from OECD, as well as case study representatives from Cleveland, Ohio, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I think I can say it's been rather an intensive 4-day visit. The visit has included 3 full days of interviews and site visits with key stakeholders here at USC at the University of Southern California, at Los Angeles City Hall, and at Occidental College, where a lot of this work in LA was first initiated. Now, I have to say, sadly, the rain got somewhat in the way of some of our planned excursions, but we did, I think, make the most of it, right? So there are many of you online, some of you in the audience today. We're happy to have you all with us. I do want to say one piece of logistics before beginning, which is that there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So my request is for those of you online, please to use the Q&A function. And for those of you who are here, obviously, so we can do it from there. So, so the plan is, instead of having the panelists present in a formal sort of way, is that they are going to respond to a set of questions to be able to help us to engage in some sort of joint learning around these intersections. And I'm going to briefly, very briefly, introduce our panelists, noting that they all have amazing resumes, and I'm not going to do any of them justice. So I would ask you please to look at the Humanitics, where there are more complete bios for everybody that is listed here. So first, sitting right here is Marka Fields, who's the interim director of the Cleveland City Planning Commission, and she brings over 20 years of expertise in land use, planning, zoning, architectural design review, and community development. And she now leads a team of 30 planners overseeing physical development and shaping both short and long-term plans that prioritize the health and sustainability of Cleveland neighborhoods. And she also chairs, very relevant to our work, the Sustainable Cleveland Vital Neighborhoods Group. The first of the bald gentlemen, the bald Italian gentleman that you see, is Rafael Trapasso, who is a senior economist at the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, Regions, and Cities. It's quite a mouthful, I have to say, and is currently coordinating the project HEI Innovate and the Geography of Higher Education for the OECD. And his work focuses on collaborations, how best to formalize ties between institutions and communities, and the continuing differences between Europe and the United States in terms of the patterns of collaboration. Next to him is Stefano Marta, who is the head of the Smart and Sustainable Cities Unit and oversees the OECD work on a territorial approach to the Sustainable Development Goals, decentralized development cooperation, city-to-city partnerships, and smart cities for inclusive growth. And prior to joining OECD, he worked at FAO on, again, territorial approaches to food security and nutrition policy. And right here, is Erin Bromagin, who is the Chief of Staff for Councilwoman Katie Yaroslavsky, Council District 5 in Los Angeles. Most recently, she served as Deputy Mayor of International Affairs for both Mayor Karen Bass and Mayor Eric Garcetti in the city of Los Angeles. She also served as the Mayor's Director of Olympic and Paralympic Development and as the Hilton Foundation Fellow on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's fair to say that she spearheaded most of the work that happened in Los Angeles and that we've been talking about over the last few days and that we'll be talking about today. So with that, please, everybody online, remember to put your questions in the Q&A function. I'm not used to doing hybrid, everybody, which is why I'm struggling with how to do this most effectively. Okay, so here's my first question to you all. From your very different vantage points, can you each talk about how you first began to recognize the value of university-city partnerships to address sustainability? And within that, kind of in what ways do you think these sorts of partnerships are of value for addressing sustainability? And what role, additionally, in addition to universities and local government, do you see for the private sector and civil society in these partnerships? Erin, do you mind if I start with you?
So I should use this mic, right?
Apparently, yes.
Okay.
People online can tell us if it doesn't make it more effective, but it's yes.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Thanks to Sophia and Caroline and the team for putting this together, and thanks to my friends and panelists here. I think to answer the question, I was lucky enough to walk into a partnership that had started to take shape when I took the job as the Hilton Foundation Fellow on the SDGs. So as I was hired by virtue of a grant from the Hilton Foundation, there was a partnership already taking shape with Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, who at the time was at Occidental College, then moved on to Arizona State and was at the Thunderbird School. So brought 2 universities into that partnership through the partnership at Occidental, which included Anthony Chase and the Young Initiative on the Global Economy. He was also able to bring in Sophia and the team at USC. And so very organically through the networks of academic partnerships within the LA area, people who had already been interested in doing more on sustainable work and sustainable development started to come together, and we were able to kind of bring this kind of unofficial consortium together to begin bringing students and actual kind of practical experiential learning into the process. That network continued to grow. We've had, I think over the last 7 years now, more than 200 students that have been a part of more than 27 project teams that we ran over the last, I guess, now 7 years, primarily in the 2018 to 2022 timeframe. And by doing all of those projects, we're able to really bring students and universities and the expertise that exists in the broader community together. I think where we didn't do as much was in the private sector collaboration. I think there's a lot of room for growth there. And I think as well in the nonprofit sector, we really struggled with finding nonprofits that had the bandwidth to really engage, right? A lot of them were documenting or keeping tabs on their work as it related to the Sustainable Development Goals by virtue of existing grant agreements or philanthropic coordination. But not a lot of them had, because they're so focused on the work at hand, not a lot of them had the capacity to capture the data or work with us specifically on developing projects related to the goals. And so I think that there's room, I think, in the future to continue to build those types of project teams that include much more multi-sector focus and bring in private and nonprofit sector partners.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Stefano, do you mind going next?
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Erin, for this partnership. It was, so to respond to your question, Sophia, when I first started recognizing the value of partnership between cities and university for localizing the SDGs, at OECD, we started this program on a territorial approach in 2018. And what we did at the very beginning of this project was to discuss and interview with various cities on what they are doing on localizing the SDGs. And I was lucky enough to meet with 2 cities that were really front runner on this topic. One was in Europe and one was in the US. The one in Europe was Bristol and was part of a network created by Brookings Institution, where also LA was part. And in that case, it was actually the university that started the process of localizing the SDGs and engaged the cities into this process. And one researcher from the university was then part of the city process for the localization of the SDGs. Was really an inspiring example on how university can, in that specific case, start the process of SDG localization. The second city, of course, was LA, and in this was invited to one of these gathering of from the Brookings Institution, and I met with Harry, and I understood all the great work that LA was doing. In this case, was first the municipality involving the university in the SDG localization process, but the work that the students have been doing preparing the voluntary local reviews was one of the good practices that we also included in an OECD toolkit on the SDG localization. In terms of values of university and higher education institution, of course, there is, we identified three main areas. One is the teaching and the research activity, because student will be the agent of change for sustainability in the future. So, of course, also the teaching, the creating capacity and knowledge in the student on this topic is key. And the second, of course, is this partnership with between university and cities, because the university can help in the data, in the monitoring, as it happened in LA, for example. And then, of course, providing a platform for collaboration between cities, university, and other stakeholders. The other stakeholder, as you mentioned, Sofia, there is the private sector, the civil society. In our program, we work a lot with the private sector, because at the very beginning of this project, we saw that some companies were taking this sustainability issue and the SDGs issue quite seriously. And we saw that the SDGs could become a platform for strengthening partnership between the local government and the private companies. And even in this case, we created an expert group with Brookings and the UN Global Compact to understand how the SDGs can help to overcome some of the obstacles between public and private cooperation. One of them is that usually the local government is involving the private sector a bit too late in the planning and policy making process. So then there is a mismatch in terms of priority. So the SDGs can be an opportunity to involve the private sector since the beginning in the definition of the vision for sustainable development in a city. And I will stop here.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Mark, do you mind? Just flip it up.
Okay, so for me, the City Planning Commission in Cleveland is very broad. And so there hasn't been like a specific, let me not say it hasn't been a focus on sustainability, but our focus is broader than sustainability. And so in terms of partnership with our local universities, it's been on planning within our neighborhoods, and we've worked with them to help develop plans in the neighborhoods, and also with data collection. They've been incredibly helpful with that. But in the meantime, city planning actually has changed. We have changed our mission statement to have a focus on health, sustainability, and equity. And so everything we do from this point has to incorporate those things in it. So we now do have more of a stronger focus on sustainability, and it really pretty much all of the recommendations that we have are going to address sustainability in it. We, in terms of our partnerships, I would say it's something that we've done since I've started working with the city. And it's been mutually beneficial between the two of us, because not only are we receiving the assistance and additional capacity from our educational institutions, we're also able to provide real world experience for the students, as well as creating a pipeline for future job openings that we have. And so that's critically important, because we're a lot of times struggling to find people who are qualified or who have the experience to do the work that we need. And having people who we already know have done the work and are quality employees is really important. So that's one of the things that I think that's really been beneficial for the relationship that we have had with our universities. In addition to that, in terms of our working with our businesses, that has not been something that city planning has really engaged in as much. We do have recommendations in our citywide plan that address employment, and one of the things that our Office of Sustainability is doing now is that they are in their climate action plan that they're putting together. They are actually addressing addressing job development and job creation around sustainability. And so that's one of the things citywide that we're doing. It's just not specifically focused in city planning. And so we do partner with them, and the plan that they are creating will then be incorporated into the update of the citywide plan that we are doing now. Our previous one was adopted in 2007, which actually had a chapter specific to sustainability and was the catalyst for the development of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in the city. So we, as a city, we are actually focusing on that, but it's not specific to city planning.
Great, thank you. Raphael.
Thank you. Good morning. Everything was said already, but let me open a parenthesis about the OECD. We are basically the R&D department of public policies, and we are, for this reason, we see probably before other local or public entities what happens in public policies. And the function of the OECD is, of course, what we say inquisitive, in the sense it's to compare different experiences and provide benchmarks, rankings. Probably you are familiar with PISA, for instance, which is the OECD test for the competences and skills of younger students. There is, however, also inquisitive, but also meditative part. That is when we think about the changes that are emerging in public policy space. Now, you think OECD was created in 1961, 61, yes, and the initial working group were like 7 or 8 as areas of public policies. Now there are more than 250 bodies. And the mouthful name of the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Cities and Regions tries to put together this territorial dimension with an industrial and productive dimension of SMEs and entrepreneurial ecosystems. So what I wanted to say is just that we operate at the frontier of public policies, and there are many things that happen. There is a long process of decentralization and devolution of power, perhaps not in the United States, but more in Europe, that influence this territorial approach. So that there are many data that were provided by technological improvements, and then if you have more data about regional and territorial dimensions and definitions, you can then accompany public policies at the local level. Even in higher education domain, there are some significant changes about the way in which higher education institutions, including research universities like these, perceive their own role vis-a-vis communities. And then, you move from the ivory tower, which probably never existed, but it's a concept of separation, to an agenda of engagement, an agenda of entrepreneurship, which inevitably alters and changes the relationship between the higher education institutions and their surroundings. So, sorry about the long hat. I'm Italian. I like to chat. But the first time that we realized that there was a connection between the sustainability agenda and higher education institutions were in Sweden, interviewing a lot of small or relatively regional universities that were saying, and among all the things that we do, we also cooperate with municipalities, because it's our social responsibility, and we help them with evidence, with analysis, with analytical capacities, so to facilitate the introduction of environmental and social dimensions in public policies at the local level. This was 2018, so it's very similar to in chronological terms. So, of course, when you go to Sweden, you expect that, there's a green sustainability, etc. But then this resonated also in places that you wouldn't expect, and also with partners that are not necessarily higher education institutions or local governments. And for instance, the connection with the Lumina Foundation, which is civil society, was key to give visibility of resonance to a policy issue that is not mature probably yet, but that exists and is unfolding and developing, and probably will bring us to another group at the OECD, so 151, that will deal with this point of territorialize the SDGs leveraging on higher education institutions. Thank you.
Thanks. I do want to say that one of the things that brought us all together was the SDGs, but recognition of the SDGs here in the US is more limited than we hoped. And so what I wanted to ask is if each of you could quite quickly say something about how you situate your work or don't in the SDGs, right? Like how they become relevant very specifically, so that there's some tangible examples of like that we're able to look at around SDG related work in the last years. And I guess within that is there's the SDG framework, and then there's sustainability more broadly, right? So when you think about that, has the SDGs been really useful for advancing? And if we could just do like a quick kind of down the table on this one before we go to some specific questions. Erin, I see you grabbing the so go for it.
I'll go first. And I think that the SDGs, we use this term a lot early on, is that they're kind of a common language, a common framework. They're meant to be universal. They're meant to be applied to the context in which they are adopted, right? And so I think without the context of local government engagement, you lose some of the connectivity to being able to deliver on the goals themselves. But without the common language, you lose that connectivity between initiatives, right? So that it works both ways, right? At the local level, as we're working to zero out carbon emissions on our grid, right? That's something that applies, right, within the framework of the SDGs. And using the iconography and the language of the framework gives us an ability to quickly find partners globally who are doing the same work that may have different applied contexts from which we can learn. And so I think that's just to keep it short.
Thank you. Anybody else?
So as OECD, we also see a lot of value on using the SDGs because they become a framework for policy making. They're not just a framework for reporting, but they can be used as a tool to shape and implement policies. For example, in the Regional Development Policy Committee that we serve in my division, we develop what we call the OECD Regional Development Policy Paradigm. And we immediately saw the value of the SDGs to implement this new paradigm of public policy because it has some key elements that the SDGs can help implement. For example, multi-level governance. The SDGs can be really a framework to align priorities across levels of government. Evidence-based policy making, they provide a framework of indicator that is common across countries, regions, and cities, so they can really help to monitor the policy. As we were discussing, they are a common language, so they can provide this language to strengthen partnership between local government, private sector, civil society, and research institution, because they provide the same universal definition of sustainability that perhaps was missing before. So this is why in 2018 we launched this program, Territorial Approach to the SDGs, and we have been helping 12 cities and regions in OECD countries since then to implement these sustainability goals. And we focus on three main areas in our program. The first one is to learn how this framework can help to implement public policy. The second one is monitoring, and we develop for all cities and regions in the OECD a monitoring framework that is publicly available in our website, and that every city and every region can use to see where they stand compared to the SDGs, compared to the OECD average, and compared to the national averages. And third, we created a community of practice to work on this. So every year we organize what we call the OECD Roundtable of Cities and Regions for the SDGs, where we bring together the cities, the region, national government, the UN agency working on this topic to discuss how to advance this agenda.
Yeah, no, very briefly, because everything has, again, but I agree with everything, but it's about the non-linearity of public policies in the sense that it connects in an interesting way input and outputs. And so if you are focusing on skills, you should also focus on investment to create jobs, to attract those skills, and I think that the SDGs platform helps a bit to take into account synergies and potential complementarities among policies, including at the local level. So this is a part that is particularly interesting for us, operating between different policy domains.
Yeah, so the city of Cleveland has not currently embraced SDGs. That's something that is a fairly new concept to us. And so we are really in the process of kind of educating people on what the SDGs are and what it means, how it actually is beneficial to utilize this as a framework. I think one of the things that would be beneficial is having a common language and really being able to understand where we're headed as it relates to sustainability. And I think that we, right now, we have people who are kind of, their idea of sustainability is very different and maybe not as comprehensive as the SDGs. And so having this framework, I think, will help us not only to be comprehensive, but also to be able to work together across departments outside of the city, with our other partner agencies, as well as our businesses and the community residents. And so it's something that really we have to kind of massage into the city. And some people who maybe are aware of it aren't necessarily supportive of the idea. So, I think it's really going to take a lot of education to really be able to get this integrated into the way that we think about sustainability. However, we are, again, still addressing some of the things that deal with the sustainability goals. And one of the projects that we've been working on recently is dealing with our vacant land, which the city of Cleveland has over 18,000 vacant lots. And that's as a result of the 2008 housing crisis, where we lost a lot of housing, you have a lot of vacant land, and also industry leaving the city. And so we're not only left with vacant residential properties, but also vacant land that is contaminated. And so trying to reuse that land has been a challenge. Very expensive to remediate brownfields, but also when you look at residential, because it's scattered site, being able to assemble enough lots to take care of like infill housing and things like that is also a challenge. And so those are some of the things that we've been working on and looking at how do we bring housing to the community. So right now we're looking at modular housing as a potential option and trying to keep it affordable. And that's the other thing is that, housing now in Cleveland, which I know does not translate to LA, is about $350,000 for a new home. But average income is somewhere around $40,000. So it's not really affordable. And so those are some of the things that we really kind of have to address and we're looking at as it relates to creating sustainable communities.
Super helpful. Super helpful. Erin, I'm going to turn to you again because LA is really kind of seen as been at the vanguard of all this SDG work. You mentioned in your first intervention data, and data is really important to everything that we all do. When you decided that data was going to be central to the SDG work, was there data that already existed that you could bring in immediately? Did new data have to be generated? How did you work with data and how did you think about that? Because I think that that's something that connects to what we're all doing.
That's a great question. I think, so as we were starting, I think the first thing you do, hopefully with, consulting training, right, is to kind of do a current state assessment. So what's happening, right? When we had this grant from the Hilton Foundation by virtue of a very wise man named Ed Kane, who was the VP of programs at the time, who had spent 30 years at the UN and said, this is the first time that the UN has kind of stopped doing these sequential compact for this or convention on that. And they really brought everything together under this rubric of the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's see, knowing in 2017 where we were as the United States government, right, unlikely to do a lot of work at that point in time on the SDGs, let's see what a local government could do. And it happened to dovetail really nicely with a lot of momentum that had started to build around the international cooperation that we saw in 2014-15, the Paris Agreement. And so not wanting to lose that momentum and seeing how local and regional governments could play a key role in helping continue and sustain that progress. And so with that insight, right, we started first to look at where is there data already? Where did we have data? And one of the first things we found is that, very, very really, the SDGs weren't written for implementation by a local government, right? They were adopted by national governments with language that connoted the international system and the national government system among its member states. And so the first thing we really had to do is kind of re-level set the language of the targets and the goals to understand how they applied, in essence, to the local context. And what we found was that some of them just didn't, right? And then some could be tweaked, some could be adjusted, right? So we actually kind of customized our own target language across the 169 targets of the 17 goals, and then started looking for the sources of data that could support. And what we found when we started looking was that some of the data is very static, some of it is very easily obtainable, and some of it were data sources that could get to the intent of what the target as modified was attempting to capture, but really needed to crowd in multiple data sources to give us a broader context. I think the key in the data question is really how then does it help you drive policy? And what we found when we dug into that and dug in further, right, is that at the local level, with a specific area, geographic or demographic context, you can disaggregate data to really understand how to shape policy more effectively. And that's where when you look at some of the data around poverty measures, for example, not only can you truly understand not just like the amount of money per day or the poverty rate as reported at the federal level, but really what is the real cost measure of life in Los Angeles versus Cleveland or any other city in the US, right? How does that translate to our community? How does that disaggregate by race and gender? And are there certain communities that have been chronically left behind as we see general trends of improvement along something like the total percentage of folks in LA living in poverty versus, right, how we're looking at it without that disaggregation. So you may see a general trend in positive for something like poverty, but when you disaggregate, you see that there are communities being left behind. And true to the mantra of Agenda 2030, that no one should be left behind, that gave us more insight that I think is not necessarily something you can home in on at the national level. And so we started to, I think, with that kind of argument, begin to look across all of those targets where we can crowd in data to help us better inform policy, and also try to create that message that the local context that city adoption and city really internalizing of this framework can help drive.
Thank you. Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. I mean, I was going to say, please, folks, put your questions into the chat, those of you that are not in the room, because I think that raised a lot of things that I think people are going to have things to think about. Stefano, can I ask you this question? I mean, we think about OECD as a large multilateral organization, right? So why would a large multilateral organization be interested in localization? Like, and what, you mentioned the words a territorial approach to SDGs, both of you, but what does a territorial approach to SDGs actually mean? How is it that from the perspective of OECD that you work with us?
Starting from the why, Sophia, the reason is that we did some analysis when we started working on the SDGs, and we managed to estimate that out of the 169 targets of the SDGs, at least 105 cannot be achieved if local and regional government are not engaged. So, and based on this data that we managed to develop, now we say that the SDGs are a shared responsibility across levels of government. So cannot be, although they were of course designed mainly by national government, although of course the CD, our main counterpart is always the national government, because everything that we do, we need to respond to specific committees, and in this case to the Regional Development Policy Committee. So we need to discuss, engage, and shape our work with the national government. Without the engagement of the subnational level, the SDGs, as many other agenda, cannot be achieved. So this is why we started working on this topic. What do we mean by territorial approach to the SDGs? This is the terminology that we use at the very beginning, because the idea is just that it's not only the local level that can be achieved the SDGs alone, as cannot be achieved alone by the national level, but it's really this cooperation across levels of government that can help to achieve the sustainable development goal. So territorial approach means providing a place-based perspective to national policy. So it's not just about local development, but it's really that national policy should have this territorial perspective. Our work is based, we define a checklist for public action to localize the SDG that is based on 5 main components. The first one is to mainstream the SDGs in the local and regional development policy, and we've been working with various cities. Just to give you an example, the city of Bonn has been using this framework of the SDGs to, what Raffaele was saying, promote policy coherence. So manage trade-off between potentially conflicting objectives. In that case, was between reducing environmental pollution from mobility, but at the same time, avoiding having a negative impact on inequality. So some ideas like introducing congestion charges. We did some analysis, we saw that this could have had a negative impact on inequality. So you cannot focus only on the environmental objective or only on the social objective, because this, if you don't consider this trade-off, you can have a negative impact or unintended outcome on other objectives. The other 4 blocks of our framework are, as I mentioned, multi-level governance, and here the SDGs provide a framework because national government are doing national voluntary reviews. An increasing number of local government are doing voluntary local reviews. So these reviews becomes a potential framework to align priorities across levels of government. Budgeting is another key component. So we have been seeing that some cities like Mannheim or Bonn or others have been more and more trying to link the budget to the SDGs. And this becomes a way to try to mobilize first, check how much are you spending on the different goals and see if this matches your priority or your challenges. And also, second, to try to allocate resources to the area that where you're lagging behind. Then the 4 blocks is data and indicators. And here we've been saying already a lot, so we'll not expand on that. And the 5th one is stakeholder engagement. And here we have some recommendations on how to engage university, private sector, and civil society. So this is what we mean by territorial approach.
Super helpful, thanks. And you know, in some ways, it's a perfect segue, Marco, for my question to you, right? Because I wanted to talk about, you know, how sustainable Cleveland, right, engages folks to work together and design, I'm going to use your language, a thriving and resilient Cleveland to build economic, social, environmental well-being for all. But as you said at the beginning, the city is relatively new to the process of using SDGs, right? So I guess my question is really, as a city planner, how do you imagine that the SDGs are going to be or can be helpful to you? And basically, how are you thinking about this and kind of what you've heard so far?
Sustainable Cleveland actually was a very successful program that was implemented starting back in, I believe, 2009. And it really was a way to kind of bring everybody all over the city together from different sectors to start discussing, like, how do you implement sustainable practices in the work that you do? And how do we begin to address some of the issues that we have within our city? And so people started talking across sectors and really kind of brainstorming about what some of those strategies could be, and then created lasting organizations that continued the work beyond the summit that they had. It was basically an annual summit where they brought everybody together. And so a lot of those have continued, including the one that I lead, which is Vital Neighborhoods. And so I think utilizing SDGs under that with that framework, again, as I said before, has an ability to really help us to have that common language that we currently do not have. I think that, you know, we have a lot of people who have participated in this work who their focus mainly is on climate change or physical development, but leaves out the social aspect of it. SDGs pulls all of that together, and I think that's really kind of where we need to be headed in the future. With city planning, we've actually done 3 different, in the past, like 30 years, done 3 different citywide plans that are the comprehensive plans that guide our development. The one that was done I guess it was two plans ago, was focused solely on people. It was a social plan, which was very important. But then the next one was only physical. So the third one that we did was a combination of the two. And the only way for any of this stuff to actually be successful is to look at both of them together. And I think that's what the SDGs does. And that's that framework I think will really be beneficial in terms of how we can move this work forward. So yeah, I think that it's something that really just needs, as I said, needs to be kind of massaged into our community through business development, as well as our social organizations and the city of Cleveland.
Super helpful. That was super helpful. Raphael, your division is entrepreneurship and education, right? So the question about how the SDGs fit in this area, I mean, education is complex, entrepreneurship is complex, how they define success may be different. You know, how is it that you see that localizing the SDG can be of value to boosting both entrepreneurship, innovation, and education?
Yeah, thank you very much, because this is an important point to us, because this project is not about the SDGs or the territorialization of the SDGs. It's about the assessing the capacity of connecting higher education institutions to local governments. We want to help local governments perform better in the SDGs, leveraging the analytical governance capacity that is in their higher education institutions. Now, over the past 20 years, because of phenomena also in this country, like the Silicon Valley, you know, it's very evocative, but it changed a bit the narrative about higher education institutions and entrepreneurship, because at a certain point, policymakers got the idea that connecting research to innovation was generating amazing entrepreneurship opportunities, which of course is a bit of a myth, but helped to bring entrepreneurship into very conservative environments like higher education institutions. And this was like a virus, because once you introduce entrepreneurship, you come as an educational tool, then you need to look for mentors, case studies, businesses to connect with, and then it changes the organization of the higher education institutions that inevitably takes, and look around and understand that it's part of an ecosystem, it's part of at least a community. And so this part of entrepreneur, and then, this is the part that opens up higher education institution towards collaboration. Then entrepreneurship as an education, as a pedagogical tool, is experience, it's experiential learning. So it's something in which you want to create, smaller groups of people. You want to have an individual following up, with students, give them the capacity of developing a transversal set of skills, entrepreneurial mindset, we call it. Then, of course, it's difficult, and this is a bit of a conundrum for us, in the sense it's difficult to measure, it's difficult to understand. There is some magic that takes place, but we know that that kind of education is useful because, you activate key agents within the higher education institution, like students, faculty, and staff, and you put them at the service of a local development agenda that is we are not on anymore in the 80s. And so the local development agenda now is based on dimensions that incorporate social inclusion, environmental performance. And so that kind of entrepreneurialism is now connected with the local development agenda that has more dimension, is a bit holistic, if you want to use a word. So I think that this is the connection that we can make. And of course, then there is behind that, there is a bit of a technological approach in which you can say that we hope that some unicorn in the sense of some very innovative startup will find out how to solve some specific environmental issues. You have social entrepreneurship, about the possibility to fill up policy gaps with intervention from the market that is oriented to provide people and community with services that otherwise are not accessible. So, I mean, I could give a lot of example about this, but it's a very stimulating area for us to work with. Thank you.
I'm convinced. Okay, I have one more question for the panelists. I also then wanted to give the opportunity to our Sao Paulo visitor as well as the other person from Cleveland if there's anything you'd like to add, but I then want to open it up to questions more generally. So, all right, I think it's pretty obvious this is a complicated moment for our country, right? How is funding, how are our political wins relevant to how you think about engaging with the SDGs moving forward? I feel like I sort of have to ask. And just thinking about global frameworks in general, not only in the context of data, but basically kind of reaching kind of the point that you were making to generate policy change. Like, how is it that this, in this moment, that you see that this can be possible and relevant? And who wants to start? Everybody starts to look at this like, okay.
Sure. Yeah, so yes, it is a very difficult time.
Sorry.
And with the city, a lot of funding that we rely on is for our infrastructure from the federal government. And that, of course, now is threatened. And so we are looking at how do we then continue some of the work that we're doing. And I think everybody kind of is on pins and needles right now, trying to figure it out. And I don't think anybody has a solution. But we are, of course, waiting to see what actually transcends from all of this. We have a state who is a red state, so they are also in line with federal government right now, those policies. So those are things that we really have to seriously consider in what we do and how we move SDGs forward. So it's going to be particularly challenging. One of the things that we do have is a very strong nonprofit sector, which they have some separation from federal government. And so partnering with them, I think, is going to be really helpful. Of course, continuing the partnerships with the educational institutions and also looking at our philanthropic community. They are really going to be a source that we need to tap during this time. But then that also makes it more competitive because now that dollars are drying up in certain places, they are thinking about how to redirect funds. In fact, I just had a call about funding funds that I was requesting, and it got dropped because they were figuring out this is, we have to figure out how to support all of our different organizations, and so now we have to reprioritize. So it's hitting home, and I think it's we really have to think about, we can't really, in order for us really to move forward effectively as a city, we can't negate the SDGs. We cannot look at it and say, we're just going to drop it and we're going to follow what the federal government is saying, because otherwise we're going to suffer as a result. And so I think we have to be very strategic about it. What the answer is, I don't know.
Fair enough. I think none of us do. Yeah, I'm totally with you. Sorry, Erin.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Marcus said, and I think, it's a moment where we have a chance, and having been in local government from the period of 2017 to 2021, it was an actual opportunity for a tremendous amount of innovation and building new connectivity networks and partnerships that help to stand in the values that we hold dear. And some of those values are informed by the fact that we know it works, right? Like, we should collectively want to end poverty and hunger and move towards a safer, saner planet, right? So if we can continue to find that the connections that help advance those core goals and values, that's what brings me hope. And I saw that take shape over the last 4 years. I think right now there's a certain amount of, I think, waiting to see how to bring those connections together for greatest impact. Right, that's a positive spin on the fact that I think everyone's just a little freaked out. But I think as we get past that and start to find ways to plug in, I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for innovation. And I think that innovation is going to come from places like local governments, which exist really to protect and keep safe and continue to grow the quality of life for people who live here. And we know from practice on issues like immigration, our first responsibility are to our residents. And so when we look at issues with, threats around collaboration between law enforcement and, federal immigration officials, et cetera, right, our local law enforcement knows that ways to keep the community safest is when they can trust our local law enforcement as partners, right? If we don't have that trust, people don't report crime. And you see tons of externalities that take shape that are really deleterious to the fabric of our community as a whole. And so really standing in our own experience and our practice, standing up for those values, knowing that the threats are there, a lot of them are real and not just rhetorical, but really trying to understand exactly how kind of uniting together for what will work, what we know works, what's been proven to work, can help kind of propel us, I think, into the future. So that's where I'm drawing hope these days.
I know, that feels good. That feels good. Those of you not in the US, give us some hope.
Yeah, I would have a neutral narrative about what happens. And I would say that it's evident that there will be a smaller federal state with less services because the budget is shrinking. And so this will open up opportunities for local governments to step in. Of course, it's difficult. We hope that the SDGs framework can help local government figuring out better policies with more connection. But, it's also a moment for philanthropy, private sector, communities to get mobilized and support this effort towards buffering, the gaps that will be inevitably created. I think it's out of political discussion. We think that we can say that this is the dynamic that we probably are observing in this moment. Then, the international experiences are, there are several about similar trends. And I think that what it proves is that multi-level governance is a always evolving system. And in this case, we hope with new actors, there are higher education institutions cooperating again into this new emerging multi-level governance systems. Thank you.
So these, of course, are common problems even beyond the US. We conducted 2 years ago with the SGSN and the European Committee of Region a survey asking local and regional government which were the success factor in the SDG localization and the main challenges. And the two main challenges were mentioned are the first one is the lack of financial resources, and the second one is shifting political priorities to give continuity to the SDGs agenda. So some ideas that we provided in this in the report that is based on the survey to mobilize financial resources is what I was mentioning before. So linking the budget to the SDGs. Another idea is to use sustainable public procurement, because public procurement is a very important tool for public authorities to direct funding. Another idea is we saw that some cities and some regions have been preparing SDG bonds, sustainability bonds to finance the SDGs, like Kitakyushu in Japan or the Basque Country in the US. And finally, what I was discussing before, the role of the private sector. So how to use the SDGs to mobilize private investment. In terms of political leadership, I think we discussed a lot also in this week here in LA. So the key is really how to institutionalize the process of the SDG localization. So this can also survive when with the political leadership, the momentum on the SDGs at the political level can go a little bit down. So creating, institutionalizing the process, not only in the local government, but also in the university or in the other local stakeholder can be a way to maintain the work and the interest in this agenda even beyond the political cycles.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So I
If
want
I
to
could speak to something that Stefano said real fast, which is, I think it's a real opportunity for us to bring the kind of international capital markets into context of local government. So you mentioned SDG budgeting, and that's something we looked at doing in LA. And when you map the city's budget to the SDGs, you get a preponderance of dollars on the things that local government spends money on, which is public safety, right? So if we collectively wanted to divide our budget by 17, we couldn't really do that, right? A majority of our dollars are going to public safety and other kind of core constituencies within the goals. So you get that disproportionate distribution when you're at the local level that I think can conflict that. But what we also found is when we tried to talk about an SDG bond, at the time, yields were so low and the market is primarily domestic because people could take a tax write-off for SDG bonds locally, and that was limiting. So what we really need to do is go back to some of the commitments that were made by folks like the Business Roundtable in 2018 and look at stakeholder value versus shareholder value, and start seeing corporate responsibility actually invest in our communities and not just in the returns. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to open it up to take a round of questions because we're going to have to close in about 4 minutes. But that's time that moves really quickly, right? I have a couple of questions online, but I did want to ask, anything that you want to add? So, okay, good. So we can open. Yes, please. I see 2 questions from the same row. So go ahead.
Okay, real quick. Hi, thank you, everyone. And I guess my question is kind of pointed here. What's in it for OECD beyond, sustainability and opportunity and equity is great, but what's really in it for OECD to have cities working this similar framework, particularly at odds or apart from a federal mandate? Like, what is the advantage for your organization?
Thank you. Let me just take the round of questions if I may. Yeah, please.
So Aaron Brahmajim and I and our good friend Ann Kapusinski at UC Santa Cruz published a paper a couple of years ago on sustainability jobs. And the good news is that they're skyrocketing. The bad news is that there aren't enough qualified people to actually fill those positions. So it's an incentive for colleges and universities working with cities to try to find ways to fill that gap. But the second thing that's got me thinking about is that what we didn't think about in that paper is how could we use that growth and sustainability jobs and map those to the SDG goals. So for instance, if you look at renewable energy sectors, which are typically green jobs, there's a lot more gender equality. It's not gender equal, but the proportions of women working in renewables is much higher than it is in fossil fuel systems. So I think there'd be an interesting opportunity to think about mapping it backwards, right? Rather than just thinking about it the other way. I know. You made me think of it. Too late. It's already published.
There's still time. Is anybody on this side, anything that you want to add in terms of any questions? I have 2 questions that are online that I want to make sure to be able to give some attention to, which is about how collecting data actually leads to decision making, right? Like, how does that actually happen? And in terms of collaboration with the local community, how are these policies actually implemented? So I have those questions as kind of an umbrella, and maybe we just go down the row and people can respond to whatever they like, and then we'll close out.
I will start quickly. Thanks for the specific question. I think this common framework of the SDGs for the OECD, in particular working on cities and urban development, has 3 main advantages. One is that there is, of course, the OECD, one of the key focus is data and measurement. So we have this common framework of targets and indicators that we can apply to measuring progress for all cities and all regions in the OECD countries. The second one is comparability. Comparability not to create rankings of city who is doing better or is doing worse, but identifying which are some of the strengths and some of the areas of improvement for cities and regions. And this will provide the third key advantage, that is the exchange of good practice, because maybe the city of LA looking of New York maybe New York is doing better in 3 SDGs and worse in 3 other SDGs. So the idea is not saying that LA is better than New York or vice versa, but understand what New York is doing maybe in 3 specific goals that LA can learn, and vice versa, what New York can learn from LA sustainable development policy. So it's this framework of comparability, of platform for exchange of information that is very important for the OECD, in particular working on cities specifically.
Can I respond to the point of collecting data?
You may respond.
Yes, exactly, because I think that this is of course, evidence-based policy making, so in the sense that you need the data to light to illuminate where you are going. But I think that the key point will be a discussion about the evaluation of the results, because we at the OECD we have this machinery to produce data, to harmonize data, definitions, etc. But everything fails if when it comes to evaluation, then is a punitive approach to evaluation. You see what I mean? In the sense that it would be important to use evaluation and monitoring as an instrument to learn from glitches and then improve the performance. And in a very open situation, probably not now, but we could use this evidence-based approach also to improve the SDGs itself. The SDGs is not perfect. The SDGs has very structural problems of mixing up input and output indicators. Number of beds in hospital is not a good indicator for the quality of health services itself. So, but of course, now we cannot open up this part because of the Pandora box, because otherwise it could generate problems. So I think that what is important about collecting data and policy making is about generating a new culture towards evaluation and monitoring.
I just agree with what Rafael just said. And I think we saw that acutely at the local level. So to take the last 2 questions in kind of tandem, I would just say, I think first, you can always do a better job of linking the work that we're doing on evaluating and reporting and monitoring on the SDGs to the actual policy outcomes that you're seeking to achieve. I think we were able to do that in some contexts more easily than others. So I use this example a lot, but SDG 3.6 deals with traffic fatalities, right? And so we were able to, when you look at that and you're trying to reduce traffic fatalities, you need to understand where they're happening. So that's one of those key indicators, like Stefano mentioned, that without local context doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So where are that? Well, when we look in the city of Los Angeles, you can point to, 80% of the traffic that's happening in like a couple of key intersections, right? So what are we doing to improve those key intersections? And you get programs like Vision Zero that try to take shape and try to implement success that's happened. I think Vision Zero was piloted out of, Sweden or somewhere in Europe, and we're able to adapt it into an LA-based context and really focus in on the types of improvements that can mitigate traffic fatalities, pedestrian fatalities in specific places. So that's kind of how I think you link that largely. But I also want to point to something that Rafael just said, which is that a lot of the SDGs are lagging indicators or are compound indicators, and it makes it very difficult to unpack, right? If we're trying to reduce poverty, right? Well, poverty is a very multifunctional reality. So what does that actually mean in terms of trying to mitigate some of these things, and how do you get more specific? I think we're able to start doing that, and we start doing it when we can really layer data effectively. One of the projects that students worked on in the summer of 2020 with Sofia's support was looking at how to build data layers around a street asset mapping, right? So when you're looking at street assets from a city perspective, bus shelters, cooling effect, street cuts, all of these types of things that manifest in our sidewalks, right? From accessibility to climate mitigation, to heat mitigation, to public transportation, right? All of these things are overlaying, right, with the realities of who's living there, who's using those public spaces, and how we're making them more effective. And so without that type of compound look generated by place-based realities, I think it's very hard to make tangible progress. And so that's where my advocacy will continue to be for looking at large, universal agendas like the SDG framework with input from local government that can actually make it real.
What's this out?
So I'll say, everything Erin said is very true to Cleveland's. We also are working on zero, and that's how we use data to determine where we need to invest dollars to improve our walkability and safety at different intersections. In addition to that, we've used the Far Safe Routes to Schools program, which it outlines safer routes for children to go to school. And you're looking at where are some of the interventions that need to take place. And so that was something that really helped us to determine like where are we going to prioritize. And it wasn't just looking at the safety aspect, but also the equity aspect of it. Looking at the demographics of where the communities that are in most need. And we prioritized how we and where we put our interventions based on equity and safety. And so that's one of the things I think that, the data is really important for helping to direct that, but then also helping to evaluate the success of it. And so that's pretty much how we've used the data.
Super helpful. Thank you. Thank you, all of you amazing panelists.